This event, called My Generation, is going to have a look at what the 60s really meant to two rather important commentators on life and social issues and politics and all sorts of things. And to my far right, I found a nice piece of biography on him just online, so I could read this out and then he'll tell me where it's wrong. But I think it was on a website that's related with you, so feel free to disagree with any of this, Cecil. But Cecil Gutzmore was former researcher and professor at the University of the West Indies and has published many essays related to the Afro-American diaspora, and in particular about the political processes that have negatively influenced the black community in England. He's in charge of the Pan-African Social Community Forum in Brixton, an organization that promotes awareness and understanding among the people of African descendancy with the objective of developing their own independent identity. He's also an expert on the life of Marcus Garvey, and if I remember you saying correctly, arrived from Jamaica in 1961. Whereas in the middle, Michelle Hanson will be known to many of you as the writer, a journalist, and columnist with the Still Here column in The Guardian, who also has 3 books published. Or is this the 4th? Or is it the 3rd or the 4th? 5. Forgive me, I'm terribly sorry. But her latest is the Sunday Times bestseller called What the Grown-Ups Were Doing, an Odyssey through 1950s suburbia. And one of the reviewers said that if you can remember the 50s, then you can bloody well certainly remember the 60s. So hopefully Michelle will be able to recall all of it for us. Would you please give a very warm welcome to Cecil and to Michelle. And thank you to you for turning up on such a beautiful sunny day to be in a rather chilly Queen Elizabeth Hall. If you get cold knees, you might want to warm up with your jacket or something. Cecil, can we start with you, please? Because I'm interested in this dynamic that you had in 1961, which I had in the 70s, of arriving here as a sort of fully formed human being, but not being of this place. I came from France, you came from Jamaica. Tell me what led to you coming to the UK and what you found when you got here.
Okay, I did come to the UK in 1961. Joining my family of origin, which had started to assemble here in 1951 when my father first came. In 61, I joined my mother, father, and brother and sister. My sister is in the audience. My mother and father have passed on. And I was born in Jamaica in the middle of the 1940s, in the year that Noel Coward discovered Jamaica. Read his autobiography. Read his autobiography and you will see. And I was formed there because I was already more than 17 when I arrived here, without any qualification because I was bad at examinations, but with a very strong commitment to a kind of Baptist fundamentalist Christianity. Jamaica formed me in terms not just of Christianity, but in terms of a kind of Jamaican nationalism, a kind of regional nationalism. Jamaica became an independent state in 1962, the year after I left, and the Federation of the West Indies was very much in the air. It failed in the year that I left. Britain designed many failed federations at the end of empire, as some of you might know. In fact, none of them succeeded, and there were about 5 or 6. East Africa, Central Africa, Malaysia, and so on, all failed. So, but that gave us a sense of regional identity. Of course, it helped. Cricket also helped. And in those days, or just about at that time, we started to win, inspired by Frank Worrell. And so living in England during the time that the West Indies was a successful cricketing power made a big difference as far as I could see. Now, as I say, I came in 61, and my father had a house in Private Eye, which was founded in the same month that I arrived here, called Your Actual Neasden. Now, Private Eye's Neasden was a real place. It had the Welsh Harp, and it had a park, and it had a library. And this was the first time I had encountered a real public library. So I read the books, and the books that were available amongst them were some of those that were condemned by fundamentalist Christianity, like Charles Darwin and so on. How can that foolish man have said that we came from monkeys? And of course, Darwin doesn't say any such thing, or at least not in that way. So to find the real story led me to a radical transformation. I was no longer a believing Christian, no longer, in fact, a believer in any kind of religion, no longer somebody who believed that the world had been created by some external force, and I proceeded from that. I worked here and studied here. The place that I worked in Neasden, was a place that was already experiencing some kind of change. When I arrived in Neasden, it was residential, and there were still some industrial enterprises. Associated Industries, Electrical Industries had a factory. Smiths Industries, the legend of which was a name with a world of meaning, filled or virtually filled the Cricklewood end of Neasden. All of that was already going when I arrived, and after a short while it had gone. And what that symbolized in microcosm was Britain's move away from industrial production to, what does it become? Capitalist finance, capital, and whatever else. So that's the place in which I came, and the changes were already visible. I got to Leicester University in 1967, and it was a moment of student uprising, but that late 60s was also a moment of flower power. It was a moment of resistance by the third world to Western power. The Vietnam War was on. In Southern Africa, there were wars of national liberation, and one was into all of that. And black power was thriving in the United States of America. And so in addition to that, I also discovered Bob Dylan. I also discovered Leonard Cohen. I was taught sociology very briefly by Tony Giddens, who went on to greatness at the London School of Economics. And he'd just come back from California, and amongst the things that he did was to organize a lecture with strobe lights and you know, one of the things that he brought back was psychedelia from the west coast of the United States. And that was very much that moment. While I was at Leicester, a man called Chris Guzzi put flower power emblems into his chemistry PhD. As I say, it was a moment of student resistance, student uprising. There was a sit-in in the year that I got to Leicester, and I participated in it. I was amongst the groups that organized the sit-in, as it were. So the student movement, the black movement. Leicester had a small black community. It was the Asian part of it was much more rapidly expanding, and I linked into. There was actually a little place in Laurel Road in Brixton in Leicester, Highfields, Leicester, called the Black House, and I related to those people. It was a moment of where people were devising new play policy based on adventure playgrounds, and I picked up on that idea and led the committee in Leicester University that organized an adventure playground on the corner of a park in Highfield that's actually still there. I ran the committee, and we raised 20,000, whole heap of money in those days to build this place, which was the engineer for it, or the architect for it, was somebody who worked with Ove Arup. So the connection was kind of high up. We did lots of other things, but importantly, I also discovered Jimi Hendrix. I didn't meet him, unfortunately, and the way that I came to encounter Jimi Hendrix was that a white fellow student said, "You haven't heard of Hendrix? He's the most orgasmic man I've ever come across. And that was my encounter with, my first encounter with Jimi Hendrix. But the 60s was emphatically a transformative moment for me and for the UK. The major economic changes were the ones that were already visible and the ones that I've already indicated. It was the moment of Harold Wilson, and people virtually don't remember who he was. It was the moment of Sir Alec Douglas Hume, who a member of the Lords, who Bernard Levin called a cretin. I think it was ungenerous, but might have been close to the to the reality, and so on. And one experienced and enjoyed all of that, and as it were, in 1970, was ready to move on to being a research student, being a different kind of activist in London, participating in black community politics in a, how shall I say, serious, critical way. I mean, at Leicester, I decided that Marxism made sense. I was briefly a member of the Communist Party of Great Britain. It's not something that I need necessarily be proud of, but what I learned in that moment was that Marxism made much more sense than any other social philosophy that I have up to that point or since encountered. I came to the conclusion that the racism that African nationalists criticize Marx of is less important than they say. I came to the view that Marxism was available to be fundamentally modified, not just by feminists, who were also a major force in the late 60s, but by black intellectuals. And the brand of Marxism that I have since carried is one that's been impacted by people like me, infusing into it a class dimension and a gender dimension, not class, a race dimension and a gender dimension. And other people here, Alric Cambridge, with whom I worked on a magazine called the Black Liberator, and Stuart Hall and so on. What we have been doing is making Marxism a much more dynamic and universal philosophy than it actually started out being.
Cecil, can we pause there?
Yes.
That's a really good synopsis of your biography. I just want to bring Michelle in, then can we start to unpack some of these things? Is that okay? Mm-hmm. Michelle, can you explain to me what it was like for a young, late teenage girl from Ruislip who'd grown up in a Jewish household, seeing this cultural revolution happen on the doorstep, and how frustrating it was or how necessary it was for you to leave the suburbs and find your way in this great youth generation?
Oh, well, the suburbs were fine until you were about 13. I was in Ruislip, which is very, very, very dull. Is that better?
Oh, sorry, let's get it in front of your mouth. There we go. Thank you.
Tremendously dull in Ruislip. All right, if you were little, it was wonderful because you were free. Even my very protective mother let me go and play in the fields and the woods and everything by myself with my friends. But it was very, very, very boring. There was nothing to do. Everything, I don't know if anybody remembers, but everything was shut on a Sunday. There was absolutely nothing to do. And then some of my relatives still lived in Barrow-in-Furness, which is where my mother's family came from, which was probably even duller than Ruislip. And in Barrow-in-Furness, I remember I started hearing Little Richards, Chuck Berry, and then, of course, Elvis came a bit later, and everything started to get a little bit excited. So by the time we were 13, 14, Ruislip began to get really sort of made you want to scream and just get out of it. And then I was at a very sort of stuffy girls' grammar school that my parents had paid for because I failed the 11 plus twice. I couldn't do the maths. And they were terrified of me going to the secondary modern. In the 50s, the secondary modernist schools were where all what my mother called the common people went. They were, they got a very bad deal. That was 80% of the children. Only a few of us went to grammar school, and then there were the technical colleges that weren't taken seriously. All the common people went there too, and they weren't, they never took technical education seriously. Very snobbish, the British, about anything technical, manual, or that isn't academic. So luckily I went to this school, haberdashers, and then I got really browned off with it, and I decided to rebel. They wanted me to do, I think that was a period when they wanted girls to do science. So they wouldn't let me do history and art. I had to do science and geography, which I hated. So I left and went to art school in about 1959. And then when I got to art school, that was a terrific shock, because really everybody was sort of, I'd come from a stuffy grammar school. I didn't know how to dress properly. I thought trendy was a sort of home-knitted jumper by my mother and a pleated skirt. And when I got there, of course, I looked a real frump, and everybody was wearing these bright colours and really strange things like purple and ochre tights and short skirts, and all the teachers at my grammar school were horrible, stuffy women in brogues with very strict haircuts and suits, very unpleasant, no humour. And here the teachers were men, and they wore Indian striped ties, and the girls wore Indian striped bedspread dresses, and they wore corduroy and things like that, which was really exciting, because then you didn't have to do much to be a rebel. You screw your hair a little bit longer. And I decided, now you have to go really berserk and stab yourself with all sorts of things and tattoo yourself, but then all you had to do was wear jeans, and you were outrageous. And then I got to art school. I decided to model myself on Juliet Greco, and I sort of grew my hair long, because there was a lot of sex, drugs, and rock and roll going on, but I didn't do it because I was scared. I'd come from grammar school, and I found myself in a class with 10 boys. I didn't quite know what to do with myself. So I wore very long, loose jumpers. I grew my hair long. I wore jeans, and I wore bare feet, partly because I've got very big feet. And then, and that shocked everybody rigid. And then we started hearing, I met a boyfriend eventually, whose landlady was in the committee of 100, and who had very left-wing friends. And my mother, of course, was a conservative. My father was actually a socialist all his life, but he never told me, pretended he was a Tory to wind me up, and he stuck pictures of Mrs. Thatcher on the lavatory wall just to annoy me. But all my new friends were communists, some of them, and in the CND, and socialists, and some of them were even like plumbers and working class, which I think probably upset my mother a bit. Because although our family started off very poor, they were immigrants from Eastern Europe, and my grandma was a street trader in Barrow-in-Furness and built up her own business. And she gets mentioned in Nella Last's diaries because she was doing black market stuff. She was apparently selling. I was very proud. A friend only told me last week that they'd read a Nella Last diary and found my grandma's shop in it because she'd been flogging dresses for £1 to people without coupons. And so they came from quite a low-class background. And I think a friend of mine recently called us, we were jumped up, we were self-made. My dad was a self-made man. We were Jewish. We were a bit common and vulgar. We weren't even an ordinary family. So there really was nothing boring about my family, except I found them tremendously boring and embarrassing. And they wanted me to do better than them, which made them send me to the grammar school. So they were very, very, I think, disappointed when I decided to not do A-levels to go to university, but to go to art school and walk around looking like a dreck, with bare feet and everything. And that's really the bit of the 60s that I hit. But I found that the nuclear problem, I was terrified. It made me really, really frightened. So I didn't really have a raving good time. I walked around weeping a lot of the time because I got so involved in it. I went on all the marches. I went from Aldermaston, to London. I went to sit-ins in Ruislip where there was an airbase. So I thought, well, Ruislip's had it. We're all going to be blasted to hell because they're going to aim for us as an American airbase here. And then, I sat down. I went on marches. I cried. I sort of worried about it. I had these awful visions of sort of nuclear holocaust and people with their skin falling off, and all these pictures were coming, from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So it was pretty terrifying. Then I sort of switched off. I thought, I can't stand this anymore. I left art school, I went to music school, and then I went to teachers training college, and that was like going back to Ruislip, that everybody was the same, almost like bank clerks. But it was a big change, you know, from Rice. It was very secure, safe. We trusted, we respected the teachers. We even respected the bank manager back then. And, you know, now, so really it was just that little brief period from 59 to 61 when I was at art school, involved with all these sort of wonderful new clothes and teachers who had sex with pupils and with each other, and everybody started smoking dope except for me because I was scared. And then I went off to music school. So it was a sort of brief burst, and it was very sort of colourful. The music was fantastic. We had such good music. And then we had Georgie Fame, and people playing at our school dances, and we had Mick Jagger playing at the Ealing Club just up the road. At Alexis Corner we used to go to see because we thought we were so groovy. And then when he didn't turn up, we got Mick Jagger instead, and we were disappointed because Mick Jagger was a bit chubby and dull, we thought.
Try and keep your mouth in front of the microphone.
Away from it,
No,
into it. Oh, that's better, sorry. So I've wasted all that speech by being too far away. And so it was very exciting. We had rock. We sneaked off from art school, watched Rock Around the Clock and things like that. And we went to, I saw Buddy Holly live, everybody screaming. So the sort of late 50s, the early 60s was really very exciting. A complete change. But the sad thing, one more thing, then I'll shut up. The sad thing was that my parents had sent me to grammar school, and they had left school when they were 12 and 14. And they liked sort of Alma Cogan, and they read Reader's Digest condensed volumes. And then once I got to my grammar school and my art school and my left-wing friends and my CND, I thought I was much cleverer than them, and I sneered at them. And what they'd done was they sort of separated me from them, and they were a bit baffled. They'd done all this for me. When I wrote about it later, I realised how hard it must have been for them. They'd given me everything. They worked like dogs. They sent me to a best school. They looked after me. And then I turn around and think they're stupid. And then it happened to another friend of mine, working class, who went to Oxford on a scholarship. And he was embarrassed by his mother. We thought our parents were sort of thick, unsophisticated, boring, embarrassing. And it must have been very hard for them, I think. So that the educating your kid upwards brings a lot of heartbreak as well.
It's the curse of social mobility
Yeah.
is when you leave where you've come from, how
Yeah.
to define who you are. Cecil, can I come back to you then? Because I'm intrigued by, this was the youth generation, this was a decade of British possibilities. Britain had only recently come out of rationing. There was still the heritage of post-war depression.
Yes.
It was a very different Britain from the Britain that we know now. I'm intrigued by the seeds that you found in you, that you found that allowed you to look at what you want, how you wanted to define yourself politically. I'm intrigued by your politicization against this background of possibility in the 60s. What do you put that down to?
Well, my own personal interest, one, and two, the nature of the moment. You mentioned the 60s. I mean, the mid-60s, there had been a decade of Toryism, of Macmillan telling the white British working class that they'd never had it so good and,
Sure.
and should be grateful. And then he had his night of the long knives, and then he resigned because allegedly he was ill. And they put in Sir Alec Douglas Hume, former Lord Hugh. And there were oppositional forces to that. I used to read the New Statesman and, believe it or not, Encounter. And at the time that I was reading the New Statesman, it was kind of both left and right. The editor for part of that time was Paul Johnson, believe it or not, who became a horrible right-winger subsequently, but he was editing the New Statesman for part of that time. And, I mean, I remember it containing two things that outraged me even then. One, there was an attack by him, actually written by him under his name, an attack on a pop evaluation program. I think it was called Jukebox Jury. And he attacked the audience of Jukebox Jury in very classist, elitist terms. And the other thing that he did, or that happened in the New Statesman at the time, was that somebody said, this is now during Harold Wilson's government, that somehow Britain had stumbled through an incomes policy into socialism. And I already knew that was foolishness. in class terms and in economic terms. So I was moving away from all of the orthodoxies that I had grown up with, and I was also moving leftwards politically, and there was stuff happening that I needed to understand and addressed a process of understanding, and that led me to where I ended up. And I repeat that that what was happening in the States, Black Power mattered, and I knew about that. What was happening in Vietnam mattered, and I repeat, I came across that by going to an absolutely shocking photo exhibition about what the Americans were doing in Vietnam, and the whole process there, succeeding the French, was pure nastiness, and that said that the leading capitalist country in the world was doing nasty things to non-European people. And then there was stuff happening in Southern Africa, and I knew that Portugal couldn't possibly deserve to own any of Africa, let alone saying that those places in Africa weren't Africa but Portugal. So I was engaged in an education process that connected to stuff that was objectively happening in the world and in my own life.
Did it feel for both of you like anything was possible? I mean, this was the decade that saw the end of the establishment as Britain had known it for 30, 40 years prior to this.
Well, I don't know if the establishment. I don't know if the establishment ended. I think it changed,
okay.
But it's still very much there as I read this place. It's just that it manifests differently. It's no longer particularly aristocratic, but well, I think that millionaires have appeared to have replaced aristocrats. So you know. That's a significant difference. But
the point that I was going to make, I didn't quite finish, was it's also the decade that gave us the birth of satire. There was starting to be a reaction to what had gone before, and that anything was possible. The term teenager had been coined initially as a dismissive. It was a derogatory term. You know, you could walk around in bare feet and with extraordinary clothing, not terribly extraordinary by these days. But did it feel, for those of you that were there, as if anything was actually possible? The world was opened up to you, and you could be what you wanted to be, not constricted by social conformity.
Yes, everything was sort of breaking out all over, and you felt, you did feel like, I got very depressed about the bomb, but I did think things were changing a lot. Our music, everything was music, the politics, and, and I was meeting all these socialists. And also, when I went to art school, I met people from secondary modern who had gone there, because I was the only grammar school girl there, actually. And then I realised that everything that my mother had said about these dangers, because I'd been scared of the secondary modern when I was little, walking by it, because all these terrible monster common children came pouring out. And when I met them, I realised this was all rubbish, and that, and I felt that things were going to change, because I could recognise all this and that. My mother was like, old guard, unlike now, when it's so overwhelmingly terrible. It did seem much more hopeful, I think. And that we did talk about the change from deference to protest. We did defer, although the people, as you say, they were all the aristocracy, Macmillan, and because we were Macmillan and everything, and they were very distant from us, and they were very condescending towards the working class. And the working class were put into rubbish schools and rubbish housing, and they were moved out of slums and stuff like this, and dumped here and there. But although they were very snooty and condescending about it, there was a slight feeling that they were trying to be kind, and they were trying to do something, to better these sort of untermenschen that they had to somehow deal with and sort out. Whereas now it seems completely brutal, the way that the poor are treated, and I think there's no kindness at all and no sort of sense of responsibility, and I don't think we've learned from it. So I feel more depressed now and less optimistic than I did then. Then I think everything was changing so quickly and so excitingly, and all the colour, the music, the changes, and there's communism and everything, and you felt you might get somewhere, but now I think it's much more difficult.
Cecil?
I think that perhaps a key element of the change in the 60s was that youth culture moved in a progressive direction, because in the previous decade, the Teddy Boys were actually right-wing and racist. And in the 60s, even though mods and rockers fought each other, they were relating to progressive culture and connected in to developments within the, other classes in the society that were kind of progressive. So I think that the key to the progressive nature of the 60s, not that we must deceive ourselves about it, because it burnt itself out and all of that. They shot Lennon but I think that's a point I want to make, that the 60s was at the level of youth culture in a serious way, progressive, questioning, and had available to it radical black and third world and women's movements that it could actually feed off and do something very powerful with.
So much of the 60s, when we look back on it now, was about the young generation, your generation, then shocking the generations that had gone before. What shocked you?
A bit of self-criticism. I talk about abandoning abandoning a whole set of things, but I hadn't abandoned quite enough, so that at Leicester in 1967, like I say, I was on the student organizing body of the sit-in that was there, and I hadn't broke with respect for some kind of authority. So when the sit-in was happening and the Vice-Chancellor came in and a shout went up, out, 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 I was actually shocked by my fellow students' response and got into trouble from the left by the way I reacted to their response to the Vice-Chancellor, because I hadn't demystified myself of respect for a certain
authority,
kind
a sort of authority.
Social authority, yes.
Michelle, what shocked you?
Yeah. Huh?
What do you mean about the actual, what's going on with the changes?
Well, whether politically or socially or creatively.
I was rather shocked because also I had two friends who became lesbians, and another at art school who was homosexual, we used to call it then, and I found it quite shocking that the way they were treated out in society. I mean, my friends were spat at, and they had to keep it a secret. And we went to a club. They took me to a club called the Gateways. I don't know if you've heard about that. It was a very old lesbian club, and it was sort of downstairs in a cellar with a red light. But at art school, they were sort of free. Nobody minded. It was still subtle. I mean, one of the girls pretended she was going out with her cousin, so nobody really realised. But it was much more relaxed, and the world outside was really, I thought, quite vicious about them. Once you become friends, it's really difficult to understand that sort of thing. So, I think it's still, I don't know, still going on, isn't it? Nothing much has changed.
Well, you say it's still going on. What do you think the legacy of the youth generation, of that youth movement is now?
Sometimes I feel a bit disappointed. I don't know whether we've got anywhere. I mean, I think obviously it's more liberal and girls can do more what they like. We had sort of the pill, we had Tampax, we had, it sounds like nothing, but it makes an awful lot of difference to a girl's life. And and I think it's freed women an awful lot. When I look back and think what my mother's life was like, and you couldn't just leave your husband, you were stuck with him, you couldn't go. If you left your husband, he kept the children, and they were stuck in terrible marriages. They had no education, they had no outlet, they couldn't express themselves, they couldn't get a job. And now things are much better. Now, there are other things which are much worse and sort of seem to balance it out. But I think it's done a lot for women, but somebody said, it's just the pill and everything just meant middle-class men had more women to shag, but, it was sort of not all that marvellous for women. I found it rather frightening, actually. I think, on the whole, it's helped us a lot, but it was quite difficult to go through and quite scary at the time. Is that what you meant?
Yeah, no, you can answer any way you wish. It's certainly, there is no right and wrong. I'm intrigued, back to you and the politicization of you, both racial politicization and political politicization. Do you think your generation won the battles it was fighting?
No.
I mean, I think that these things have to be explained structurally. I mean, I think the movement of the 60s and 70s was able to call on real radical developments in the United States of America. Black people were burning down almost all of the northern cities. And of course it matters that it didn't go unpunished, that the United States executed illegally almost all of the leadership of the Panthers. So the thing was contemporaneously punished. But people, including white youngsters, were excited by Black Power, and there was a legitimate student movement. The yippies and all of that really were genuine social forces. And outside of Europe, stuff that I've already mentioned, the Vietnam War, the liberation wars in Southern Africa, were really the drivers of the notion that we were a new generation with real possibilities of social transformation. And of course, imperialism and capitalism didn't sit idly by. And at the end of the 70s, didn't we have Thatcher and Reagan? And at the end of that period, didn't all of the African countries that became independent also become rather reactionary neo-colonies that are in alliance with the formerly colonial masters? So for me, this moment is in a way desperately depressing, although I don't do depression, because what we have at the moment is a triumphant but also crisis-ridden capitalism and a kind of struggling, kind of desperate move against it. Isn't that what do they call themselves? That movement against the city? Occupy. That movement. You know, they have the right target, but the methods and the conceptualization and the power of the enterprises that they're moving against and the backing that they get from that those enterprises get from the state mean that they don't go anywhere. And it's almost a cheap point to make, but there's at least two books by two academics who effectively are saying that the counterculture was never really fundamentally counterculture, and this is somebody else's joke, that the counterculture rapidly became over the counterculture. And so to that extent, the excitement of the 60s and 70s have been absorbed by a market-driven, rightist, powerfully based response by the forces that oppress us. That's what neoliberalism is. That's what neoconservatism is, and that's what we have to defeat in places like this.
Well, maybe not places like this here today.
No, not in the Queen Elizabeth Hall.
And then exactly,
no,
Michelle, was the point you wanted to make.
I want to make another development which I think is really depressing is what has happened to language. And I noticed it when the national curriculum came out. I was teaching, and a sort of language has developed which means nothing. And it's a sort of corporate gobbledygook gibberish speech which nobody really understands. And what I think it is, it sort of almost deliberately mystifies everybody so that they, if you take the example of teachers, I remember reading the national curriculum, I couldn't make head or tail of it, and I thought, am I stupid? I really feel thick, I can't understand this. And I rang up, I was writing about it, and I rang, I think I rang the education authorities or whatever. I said, what does this mean? It means nothing. And the woman said, of course it does. Yes, it does. I said, well, what does it mean? She couldn't translate it. And I said, well, who wrote it? I'd like to speak to them. She said, oh, a panel wrote it. And I thought, well, this is crap, you know. And what it does, the teachers struggle through it. It takes hours to read. It takes more hours before you understand or can work out that it means nothing. And then you have to work that out, otherwise you feel that you're the idiot, and it mystifies everybody, and it forms a sort of barrier between ordinary people and whoever is controlling this. And that's where it starts, and now it seems to be everywhere. Every form of work has its jargon above which, an ordinary person cannot get, and it doesn't communicate anything. And I think it's really very damaging.
So
I'm always fighting.
Are you saying it has its roots in the 60s?
Well, it sort of started at the end of that. We didn't have that in the 60s,
Right.
and it sort of enveloped everything and crushed. It's sort of deadening. It's
Okay.
deadening, really. And anyway.
I'm aware of the passage of time, and we have a big audience, so it's time, perhaps you'd like to pitch your own questions, either at Cecil or Michelle. If we can keep it vaguely on my generation and vaguely in the 1960s, that would be good. Would anybody like to ask a question? Otherwise, we'll just carry on. But it'd be good if we had some questions from you guys. No. Oh, well, the gentleman there. I think we have a microphone. Yes, please. Thank you. Gentleman in the suit and blue shirt. Thanks.
This is one mainly for Cecil. I'm sure you're well aware of Eric Hobsbawm's generally pretty dusty
Yes,
view
I know
of
Eric,
the
yes.
student rebels and generally the whole youthful counterculture
Yes.
of the 60s. In his autobiography, Interesting Times, I was struck by the strength, the vehemence, really, of his dismissiveness towards all that. And I think he was probably talking not just about Britain, but about Western Europe and the States as well, would be my impression. But basically his view is that this was a bunch, I'm slightly crudely paraphrasing, but this was a bunch of children of affluent parents. These children were failing to grow up, failing to get serious, get real about politics, but it was the politics of gesture, essentially, and wishfulness. Yeah. And as a result, I think Hobsbawm would really argue there was a chance, there was a moment of the 60s, but because of the lack of seriousness, the lack of depth and so on, that chance wasn't taken. I think that would be a reasonably fair summary of his view, and trying to sort of stand back and, as it were, looking at wearing a historian's hat, if you like. Is he way off, or is there some truth, do you think?
Well, there is something in the rumour, and the fact that it blew itself out, as all cultural movements do. The fact that the enemy forces were organized and organizing and ready at the end of the 70s to move with the deliberation and viciousness that you got with Thatcher and Reagan and all of the things that they represent, that ends up giving us, I don't want to be too harsh, giving us New Labour and giving us neoliberalism and neoconservatism and giving us that really kind of wicked, racist, Eurocentric approach to the world. I don't know if Hobsbawm was quite saying that, but to the extent that I agree with what he's saying, even in the late 60s, in part because I was obviously black and older than, I got to university late, and older than some of the younger people who were around, and unwilling to be blown away by Trotskyism, and even unwilling to be blown away by the uprising in France, which they did manage to crush after a while very relatively easily. I think that Hobsbawm has a point, and we really have to think through more clearly and firmly than we tend to do the nature of the oppression that we currently face, how it has its continuities in the thinking and organization that the ruling forces engaged in response to the challenge that they face, not just from the youth movement, which wasn't much of a challenge, and not from the black movement, which wasn't much of a challenge. They were really able to deal with it. And so the fundamental structures of oppression and exploitation are still very much in place, and the task of liberation is still the one that we face. And I think Hobsbawm would have been saying that. He was a serious communist and serious Marxist.
Serious Marxist. I don't know if anybody heard, if anybody knows about Hobsbawm, is interested. Fantastic Radio 4 documentary on him a few days ago, actually, maybe last weekend, where his MI5 and SIS files were released about how his membership of CBGP and his interest in Marxism really curtailed his career to the point that he was barely allowed into the BBC, into Portland Place, to do any broadcasting for fear that he was going to radicalize a lot of 1960s British youth. Of course, he then, I became a friend of his in his latter years, became one of our greatest living historians, and really had earned his colours.
He was too good to be kept down, so the fact that they gave him professorship late and that kind of thing didn't necessarily matter, you know.
Exactly, but I think he understood the 60s and understood what the possibilities, to answer your question about more directly, what the possibilities of it were, and became frustrated that in a world of endless possibilities, only so few could become real in a way. Yeah, he wasn't so keen on the Stones, let's remember. Let's have another question. Yes, please, gentlemen there. If you just wait for a microphone, please. One of our fantastic microphone people will be with you very shortly. I love the fact that you were disappointed by Mick Jagger.
Yes, he was.
Sorry, I'm afraid my question for Cecil as well is just that you mentioned Stuart Hall in your talk, and I wondered if you met him or knew him. And
I met Stuart. We weren't close. He was a little bit older than me. Actually, he arrived in Britain in the year that my father arrived here, and he's little over a decade older than me. So we weren't close. But I knew Stuart, know his work, and respect it. And am at this very moment in the process of I mean, there's a lot of organizing around Stuart. And so what I and some others want to do is something that recaptures him for the community that he was part of. And one of the communities that he was part of is that community of labor and educational migration that he, in a way, joined, though at the upper end of it and from the upper end of that migration, because he was a scholarship boy and brilliant. And he wasn't like my father, who was a working man. And so...
He was a Rhodes Scholar in Oxford.
Say again?
Was he not a Rhodes Scholar in Oxford?
Yeah. That's what I'm saying. He was one of those people that the empire finished rather well educationally and sent to their top universities to do whatever it is they do there. Eric Williams. There's a whole lot of them.
Was it exciting for you that there was a Jamaican who here in England who was making such an important analysis of British culture, that he'd come from Jamaica?
Yes. But I mean, Stuart for me is important because he belongs to a tradition. He did lots of things, so that's not the only tradition. But he's an important part of a Caribbean intellectual tradition. And some of those men, and until recently they've been all men, made important contributions to understanding the nature of our world. Some of them were right-wingers, some of them were left-wingers. So that, for example, Walter Rodney is at the end of that, but Eric Williams, Capitalism and Slavery, is in that. And James, who didn't allow himself to be finished by going to university and continued to educate himself of, as it were, his own Baptist part of that tradition. So Stuart, importantly, is part of that intellectual tradition, and it has a metropolitan diaspora aspect to it. And I regard myself and Ricky Cambridge and Colin Prescott, men who you might know if you move around in the blackish left of the UK. And what I saw us as doing, still see us as doing, is actually trying to make Marxism not just the story of class, but the story of race, and some women trying to make it also the story of gender. And so, yes, Stuart was an exciting mentor, and the quality of his work, in my view, was just extraordinary. He has an essay on on South Africa, which is you won't find better theorizing of the race-class combination in that place in anybody's work.
Thanks, Cecil. There's a gentleman just behind you, microphone lady, who also like to ask a question. Thanks.
Thank you. I hadn't realised, Cecil, you and I were contemporaries at Leicester doing sociology at the same time.
Okay.
It was an exciting time. But if one future shoots a couple of 100 years and we look back on the long view, I just wonder how much we'll be accused of romanticising the 60s and 70s,
Yeah.
the 50s, 60s and 70s. And in a sense, in an organic long view, it'll be no more important than other points in the 19th, 20th century. But it's proximity that we're alive and that we can comment, and we have the means through publishing and the media to do this. Are we romanticising our youth?
Well, some do. I hope there was some detection in my representation of it that I wasn't romanticizing, although it is possible to be romantic about it, and elements of the encounter are romanticizable. The music of that moment, including the jazz, including some voices like Bob Dylan, were actually quite remarkable, and I think will last. The jazz of the 60s, Miles and Coltrane and so on, they're going to last. So there is a level at which there's a fundamental achievement in the 1960s. But what makes decades historically important is that fundamentally important social revolutions happen in them. And no such thing happened in the 60s and 70s. Not here, not anywhere else. The Vietnamese liberated themselves from Western imperialism in the middle of the 70s, and that's important. How the West responded to that, and indeed how the Vietnamese carried it on, matters. But I think that at the end of the day, the forces that were unleashed in the 60s and 70s in world historical terms achieved very little. And I've never thought other than that.
Michelle, do you think there's any danger of mythologizing or looking back at the 60s red-tinted glasses? I was surprised to hear you say you spent a lot of it walking around in tears and feeling miserable.
I did. I was terrified a lot of the time and embarrassed because I couldn't deal with the sort of sex and drugs, and terrified of nuclear possibilities. And I was just, didn't Hobsbawm, also, as you were saying, things happen then and we thought we'd got over them, and we just come round, we're back at the same point again. I think in those days everybody was terrified of communists. Communists were dreadful. My mother had a row with an au pair because she was a communist and she got the sack. I don't know why communism was so terrible then. And I think Hobsbawm, didn't he say that the communists, contrary to what everybody thought, were not trying to take over the world and make the whole world communist? They weren't trying to do that. And so we thought we got through that, but now everybody's terrified of communists again. Here we go. And also the nuclear war's coming back, and people are getting frightened about that again. And everybody's terrified of Putin and the Russians taking over the world again. So I don't think we did get very far. Only I do romanticize. I do feel it was a sort of nicer time, even though I was crying for most of it.
People do. I mean, it even says in the programme here, rather lightly, that it was the time of Bieber and miniskirts and Mini Coopers, and of course, that really wasn't what it was all about.
We didn't all have that. I think
didn't all have that.
No.
Those are the
Cecil.
counterculture over counter symbols.
Icons.
Icons, if you will. No.
I did
Michelle.
screen print Bieber's wallpaper. Because I was doing textiles and we did actually do that.
Oh, I see. You
yes,
actually did
and then
it.
I worked at Julie's Wine Bar, and all that stuff was sort of a little gang of these rather smart designers.
Do we have any more questions? Would anybody else like to ask another question? Oh, yes, please. Lady at the front. So we seem to have one microphone lady who's rushing around everywhere. Thank you very much.
that I was coming here. She said she was born in 1947, and she said she had her hair cut in Wiedhousesoon and she went to Carnaby Street. But she said she didn't take drugs. No one that she knew in East London did take drugs. She didn't have the free love thing. A girl in her street got pregnant. No one would talk to her. And she said the ideas that we have now about what it was like then are very much these iconic things. But for most people, it actually wasn't like that. Maybe if you went to art school or university, you might get more of a taste of that. But for ordinary people, and particularly just working people, young people, that actually wasn't really what it was like at all. And I'm just curious to know how far you feel our idea that we have now of what it was like actually was accurate for most young people.
No, you're right, it wasn't. Even though I was at art school, I couldn't cope with it. I sort of dressed in long, loose clothes because I couldn't deal with the sex. And friends of mine have said, you know, other people were doing it, I wasn't. Some people were taking drugs, some people weren't. But interestingly enough, in the very early 70s, when I was living in London, there was a girl in the flat below me, and she'd come over from Ireland, and she had lost a baby. She had got pregnant, and her mum had bound her up. She'd been sent away to England because of this shame. Her mum, this is in the 70s still going on, had bound her up so tightly. She'd been in complete agony, and she'd lost the baby. She'd miscarried. And I thought, Christ, you know, this is still happening. It hasn't made any difference. And when, as I said, when I went to music school, it wasn't like the 60s at all, because I thought, oh, it's another art. It's going to be the same as art school. I was no good. I got bored with the art. I thought, I'm going to play the piano. I like Scarlatti. I'm going to do this and that and the other. I got to music school and I thought, God, it's like, it was just very ordinary. Nobody was doing sex, drugs and rock and roll. And then I went to Teachers Training College, and that was the most dull of all. That was really excruciatingly dull. I couldn't believe it. I thought, I'm back in Ruislip again. And I was bad at art. I thought my textiles were very poor. When I got to art school, when I got to Teachers Training College, the art students were painting thatched cottages with hollyhocks outside. I thought, bloody hell, we haven't got anywhere. So I think your mother was spot on. That. I did have a Beaver's dress, but I think for most people it wasn't that exciting. It was very slow.
Cecil, unless you're going to be the only person to confess to actually having done drugs in the 60s.
No, I didn't. I was never into drugs. I didn't even smoke properly. I had a pipe, and I smoked cigarettes and a little bit of weed without taking any of them seriously because I didn't actually enjoy smoking. Let me just address that lady's question. It's very important that we understand that no era is characterized by what the ordinary people do, unless the ordinary people enter the stage of history in some way, and that's largely through revolution. Otherwise, eras aren't characterized by what the ordinary people do, not when you're writing exciting history. Now, having said that, the 60s did have different elements. It had all of those staid people, so that in the 60s, when I was in Leicester, what ordinary people did for their holidays was get in trains and go to Skegness. That's what Leicester working people did. A few of their children probably ended up as mods and rockers somewhere down in Southend or whatever, though it's unlikely. I don't know what the Midlands or northern equivalent of wherever the mods and rockers fought each other were. But so we remember the mods and rockers. We don't remember the fact that working people on their holidays went to Butlins or to Skeggy in train loads and van loads of people. So the 60s were those two things. They were the countercultural things which we have to assess, and they were the regular, ordinary things which most people actually did do.
Nicely put. Thank you, Cecil, and a great way to wrap up. I defy you all to find somebody who lived in the 60s and confesses to actually doing the drugs, if they can remember. I've tried with most of my family. We have to wrap up.
There's a lot of drugs around at Leicester, and it doesn't seem to have done any of them any harm, because the ones that I know became lawyers and all kinds of other things, and their brains aren't frazzled or
well,
anything.
you say that.
Yeah.
I'm sorry we have to wrap it up there. Thank you for being a part of this very vibrant discussion. But thank you to Cecil Gutzmore and to Michelle Hanson.